I wish there wasn't an actual B blood type, because it's funny when we say our blood type is C for coffee,
Yeah.
but really my blood type is like brand, and coffee.
Right.
But there's no B already exists. It ruins it anyway.
The old school Lou Ferrigno Incredible Hulk line was like something about making him angry, and he's like, "You wouldn't like me when I'm angry." And then like the new version of the Hulk is like, "Hey, the secret is I'm always angry."
Mm,
And that's me and branding. Like the secret is it's always branding. It's
it's always
always,
branding.
no matter what I'm speaking on, presenting on, it's always a brand talk.
It's always branding.
Yep.
Everything is branding. It's like those channels where everything is cake. You know, it was a shoe. No, it's cake.
No, it's
That's us.
a shoe or cake.
It's always branding. So I suppose we should talk about that right off the bat.
Probably should.
I don't have any kind of definitive let's start here idea. I think that the whole discussion comes down to a matter of nuance, technicalities, and vocabulary, and making sure that we are accurately talking about the same things. And
Right.
when it comes to talking about brand or branding, brand strategy, any of these brand derivative words and terms, I've always found it more useful to back up a step and go, well, what are we actually talking about philosophically or fundamentally or tactically? Let's not label it yet. Let's just talk about what's the desired outcome. And then we can go back and talk about what's the label here that we would call it. Because like every other thing in life, people get attached to the label. That label ends up meaning something. In other words, it makes them feel something. And when we know this from branding, when you feel it, you don't always know how to articulate that. And so we're in immediately an arena where feelings and emotions matter just as much as logic and tactics and specific terms. I think that's the challenge that we have. And I would almost like to say, okay, for every technical term that we come up with, do we step back and look at, well, what do we mean by that? What's the actual definitive purpose of that particular, idea or notion or whatever? So I think that's helpful, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting too. Thinking back to early 2000s when a lot of Marty Neumeier's books were just being published, and there was a lot of trend around brand at the moment. And I would say there was equally as much pushback within the creative and design communities against that word and that concept. And I think, as much as we quote unquote had the internet in the early 2000s, it wasn't the same place. We didn't have social media. There wasn't an easy way to have discourse in the same way. So I think it all came down to that. It was like a confusion of terms and a muddying of concepts. And when you say brand, you mean something this. And when I say brand, I mean that. And then you get upset that I've used the word because you meant a different thing than I did. So fast forward to today, we're super splintered in all of our ways to have social discourse. It's all over the place. And something you've noticed is how confused people are still by the concept of brand. And so maybe we start with that. Like what is the confusion that you're seeing in your corner of the internet and in the solopreneur world, and when it comes to creating your own personal brand for that space? Like what's the understanding or the pushback?
Yeah, it's equally splintered. And again, I think that it becomes an emotional topic. Like people emotionally relate to an idea and they don't really think through what that actually means to them, which is a problem, right? Because emotions are shortcuts to knowledge, which is what we leverage in brand all the time. If I can get you to feel the same thing that it would have taken you a month to logicize, but you can feel that in 3 seconds, I win, right? So to answer that question, I don't know that there's a specific line, but what I do see, I think consistently, is the very word itself creates a duality. So the word brand came from heating a hot piece of iron and shoving it onto a poor cow's bum to mark that cow as mine, not yours. Or if I stumble
Ironically,
upon a
back
random
then
cow.
there were far fewer changes, client requests for changes to logos.
Yeah, the cows always voted against any what we would now mistakenly call a rebrand, which we'll talk about why I think that's a mistake. But yes, the cow lobby was certainly like, no, you're good. And yeah, so it told you that's my cow, not yours. Or if you came upon a stranger's cow, it was, their cow, not someone else's. And it communicated and held a lot more information than people would like to think. And I like to use that as an example because if I stumbled upon a random cow, depending on the symbol that was singed into its bum, that would tell me, yes, who owned it, but it also told me, should I carefully walk away from this cow? Should I put a lasso around it and take it back to the owner? Or any other number of reactions, because that owner is what I really care about. Is that owner going to say I stole that cow? Is that owner going to thank me and give me a reward, and anything in between? It really held a lot more information than people would like to think. And you fast forward to today, and now we have this word brand, which has become fairly, in my opinion, it has become synonymous with the entire existence of whatever entity we're discussing. So when we say being on brand, for example, we don't mean, make sure the logo is consistently placed on everything. We mean, no, you are aligning all of your actions with a core set of principles that we have predetermined need to be communicated at all times or evoked at all times in some way. That's what
it can even be like
is.
a corporate culture thing. Like,
absolutely,
this employee doesn't fit. They're not on brand with our, like, that's not how we do things here, is what they mean by that.
Exactly right. Or product development, quality control standards, the tone of customer experience or service. I mean, this is now, so right off the bat, we use this word for what effectively modern day we call a logo. That was the origin of the word, at least on the surface level, is it's an icon. It's a symbol. It delineates this, not that. But even in the most primitive use of that particular instrument, there was information packed in that symbol on that cow's bum, as I described earlier. Well, it's just a matter of extrapolating that out into the modern day corporate or business landscape, and even the personal landscape, where that same symbol holds all of that data. It just so happens there's a lot more data there. And I get asked in the solopreneur space, kind of back to your question, I haven't had to have the discussion of a brand is not a logo in like 20 years in the professional world. You remember back then, we had that conversation all the time. I haven't had to have that conversation because they are a lot more sophisticated. Now that I'm getting into individuals who haven't had any exposure to that, type of education or experience, I get that a little bit more. Well, what do you mean that it's not the brand? Or maybe they expand that out to all the visual representations, colors and marketing, or whatever. And it's really interesting for me because I come back from like, no, your logo is not your brand. That's insane. It's a symbol for your brand and everything that comes with it. Mm-hmm. But it's not difficult for me to take one kind of like weird meta step and go, actually, your brand is your logo. Because that logo collapses all of that. Again, I said before, what would maybe take a month to understand into one emotional swoop. Back to Marty Neumeier's, your brand is your gut feeling, is the gut feeling that someone has about you. That's what he meant by that. It's whatever makes that moment collapse in their mind to make an emotional feeling happen, because we are emotional creatures. And I will go to the science of this. This is what I talk about all the time. In our daily, every single experience that we have as humans, the way that we receive data and process data in our brains happens on an emotional level first. Always. If you go down to the microsecond level and watch what is happening in our brains, it is always an emotional reaction. The problem is, in retrospect, we gain distance from that emotion and we look at it logically. And retrospect is what is tied to our memory. So we are constantly mistakenly remembering our experiences of our past as logical actions, when in fact, all of them are emotional in nature.
Yeah, we're just justifying them with the logic. That's how we build this story for ourselves later as to why we're with that person or why we took that job or why we bought that car or why I paid extra for whatever. Uh,
That's
is you justify that with the logic, but it was totally the gut of like, it felt like the right thing.
Yes, exactly. And we know this on a transactional level. We use this all the time. You and I have used this example with customers how many times? We buy with emotion, we justify with logic. That's what we're talking about. But what's happening? Okay, we're going to get into this. This is why I have said publicly that Robert Pirsig's book, Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, is the greatest book on branding ever written. And everybody who's in the brand strategy, branding space right now is going, what is he saying? He's out of his mind. But what we are talking about here, and in this book, I'm not going to unpack all of it clearly, but he talks about this idea of this train. And then we are on the train, and all the train cars are part of our experience and what we log in our brain. But what is out front in front of the train? We're on a track. There's things he calls this quality. This is a really interesting thing. But out in front of the train at all times, it is like that wheel of, becoming, or whatever you want to call it, where we're always at that moment of what is the present, what is the future, what is the past. And we're always at the very front end of the wind hitting the very front of that train. And we look at it and we what you just said 4 seconds ago doesn't exist anymore. It's recorded. Technically, I guess it exists, but in our experience right now, it doesn't exist anymore. And what I'm about to say doesn't exist
said
yet.
In Spaceballs, when will then be now?
Exactly.
Soon.
Exactly. And that is a nonstop game. And what's happening on a physiological level inside of our actual mind is these nonstop moments of emotional state reactions to our present moment that are later then reflected upon through a logical lens. I know we're not going to have time to dive into all of that stuff, but it's an introduction to how I look at branding, that is really what is happening. We are talking about how businesses and entities and individuals interact with the world through the lens of the human experience, which is to say an emotional experience later justified with logic. And we are leveraging that reality to create and reinforce, in my opinion, the way you should do it is to create and reinforce the truth about what you're trying to do so that their perception aligns with that. Yeah. And that's the gut feeling that Marty Neumeier was talking about. That's how you close that loop. And that's what it means to stay on brand.
Where it gets really complex is you've got this thing, Marty really talked a lot about the perspective of the client or the customer, that it is what they say it is, not what you say it is, meaning your brand is whatever the people who receive your brand think about it, not just what you think about it. And I think he kind of left an important thing out. So if it's a Venn diagram or we're triangulating on this thing, it's that the agency or the brand consultant or whoever the shaper of this intentional brand thing is kind of left out of his equation. So it's the agency, the company that we're creating the brand for, the person, and then the audience. So there's all the three pieces of that. Fun fact: do you know what the very first trademark was?
That's a good question. I'm not going to try to think through it to waste time. Tell me.
All right, sure. I will. Well, I will. Spoiler alert: it was Bass Ale, and Bass, the original trademark, is just a red triangle, and the reason that trademark was first developed was not because Bass was worried that somebody was going to steal their beer recipe. It was to protect the consumer. So the purpose of the trademark from the onset was so that a consumer knows when they order Bass Ale in their local pub that they're going to get an actual Bass Ale and not something else that is masquerading as that. And so if it's not trademarked, it's not the right thing. And I think that's one of those important pieces of the role of brand, the role of identity, the role of a logo to reinforce and to help a consumer know that they're getting what they think they're getting, whether it's a business to business or it's a coaching service, or it's a product, or it's a beer.
Yeah, that goes back to that brand promise idea.
Mm-hmm.
So you've brought a lot to unpack there, but that's a beautiful illustration actually of why we should look at it that way, because where else could it live? I love to use the reputation analogy, when it comes to this, because that's the closest analog that we find on sort of the everyday life personal level. And you think about somebody who exists inside of a small town community, and they go about their day, and maybe they own a little business, and they, donate to charity. They go to their local, church or whatever. And, they have kids in their schools, and, they're a present feature inside of this community, just like other.
Wait, is this a John Mellencamp song?
I'm not a fan, so no. But I think if you think about it that way, that person creates a wake in all of their actions that other people kind of live inside, and they react to that. And they think that person is trustworthy or honorable or chivalrous or not, and all down the line. And the interesting thing about that is if you act with enough intentionality over time, it's highly likely that a mass group of people are going to have the same response to that, the same reaction. In other words, the same gut feeling that Neumeier talked about. There will be a lot of continuity there. So they'll look and they'll say, Josh is a great guy. I mean, he's just, he's so positive, he's uplifting, he's caring, he's a stud. I mean, clearly look at him, right? Like they're just going to come away with all of those different impressions. And then you're going to have those one or two interactions where somebody's having a bad day and they say something and you say, well, maybe you should do this. And they're like, screw you, Josh, right? And now in their mind, well, Josh is not those things. Mm-hmm. Josh is, what is the truth? What's the reality? The reality is you are you. What other people say or do or respond to doesn't mean a thing. But if we are talking about perception and how others might react to you, then we're talking about what lives in their head, in their minds, in their experience. Where else could it live? It cannot live anywhere else. But that doesn't mean we don't influence that and we don't have control over that, or we can't persuade that to a certain extent. And that's the part that this is where most designers and creatives understand that, because they understand persuasion. They understand what goes into making an impression on someone else. In my experience, and you can speak to yours, most business owners and CEOs and founders hate that part. They don't like that when you tell them, you don't really actually own your brand. It lives in the minds of the consumers. Like they're like the witch in the Wizard of Oz. You see their feet just shrivel up under the conference room, table. But the creatives get that all day. But then when you talk about how business strategy, like picking the right product vendors, picking the right quality control measures, developing this product, not that product, entering this market, not that market, hitting this price point, not that price point. You start doing that, they light up. And you say, how do those not affect the perception just as much as any outward deliverable marketing, or other influential tool? Mm-hmm. They all matter is the point. And this goes back to me talking about, we have this split in our human experience between emotion and logic. And the CEO types tend to gravitate more towards this like logical side. And the marketing and design types tend to go more toward the emotional side. And and I think I have it right here. I'm going to shill it right there. Boom. Marty Neumeier's brand gap. I actually have it on my desk. This is where he talks about the gut feeling. That's the gap he's talking about. Mm-hmm. He's dead on. He's perfectly right. I completely 100% agree with him in that regard.
Well, I think sometimes it's easier for people to get their arms around how synonymous brand can be with reputation. So reputation is an easier thing to talk about in that regard, of that, like it's how people feel about you. And it's not that you can't have any influence over your reputation. You actually have a lot of influence over how you got there and where you go from here. But it's not something you can wrap your arms around and take with you and pack up in a box and move to a new office. It's obviously something a lot more broad than that.
You bring up something that I absolutely love, and these are two primary concepts, and it's the idea of marketing and the snake oil salesman. So imagine if I walked around and put a sign over me that says, I'm awesome. You'll never meet anyone more awesome. And I just walk around. Do you know what my brand is by the end of that day to the people I interact with? Is crazy.
Yeah.
I'm a crazy person. They're not going to just accept that I'm awesome because I put a sign out there. And this is the problem with the marketers and the CEOs and anybody else who believes that you can just market your way out of the truth. That is a gigantic mistake, and it's gross. Then you think of something like the snake oil salesman. This is, for people should be familiar with this. These are people who would back in the day travel around. We have modern versions of this, but back in the day, the term came from people who would invent these oils that were cure-alls, and they would pack up their wagons and they would go from town to town to town and go to the town square and start promoting how this was the cure-all. There was a very specific reason why they kept going from town to town to town. And that was because they constantly outran their liar reputation, right? And that becomes the snake oil salesman idea. And they're born of the same principle and same concept, that you can't outrun or outmarket the truth, especially in today's world. This goes back to why I always called myself an archaeologist first when it came to my branding concepts, right? Talk to me a little bit about the idea that perception is very real, and what are the mechanisms that you can do to influence those perceptions. It's not that we just have to, people get upset when you tell them that your reputation is what they think, or your brand is what they think. You get some people who are like, screw them, I don't care what other people think. Why wouldn't you tell your kids not to care what other people think? They get really defensive about it, as if they're being judged. And yeah, they're being judged. It's how the world works. Sorry. What else do you want from me? Right. But your actions, you don't have to obsess over that and try to run. You see people all the time try to chase that down and be something that they're not. And they become obsessive with how they're perceived. And they forget that, well, being authentic and real and just your natural self is actually the best way to be perceived in a way that you want to be perceived. Talk a little bit about that process, I guess, that line between those two realities.
Well, I mean, I think it comes back to those three different angles, right? So it's like if just left to what the company does, then the audience or the customer opinion is just going to kind of bend and shake as the company does different things. So if they're all over the board or they're really consistent, old school manufacturing company down the street in a dusty part of town, they may not have a very evident brand, and they just keep their heads down, and a couple people work there and people in the community know them, and so the awareness of the brand is very low, and there's not much that they've done to make a big deal about it. There's not an agency saying, oh, here's what we do, and there's not a whole lot of interaction with the general audience on the whole. So it's like each of those levers are things that we can pull to add more to it. So when, take that same example and say that there's an agency who says, all right, here's what we want to do to create more awareness for your manufacturing company is we're going to put your name on your trucks, and we're going to put a new sign out front, and we're going to do a PR campaign and put the owner out in front of charity events. And, this was kind of how a lot of things started happening, I would say like in the 80s, maybe even in the 70s, but it was like, all of those companies were invisible up until that point. And then you get a little further down the road, and then there's the social media aspect. There's websites and things where, your manufacturing brand might try to follow me on Twitter. Like that's kind of weird, kind of an extreme example. So you start kind of pulling people into your audience that wouldn't have otherwise been there or seen that. And I think there are things that we can do on all three of those pieces of, like, the agency can advise on things, or the consultant or whoever is helping shape the brand. Maybe it's an in-house person, but the shaper of that reputation is reacting to things. And then, on the flip side, something happens to your uncle who works in that manufacturing facility, and, he gets hurt and they don't take care of him. Well, all of a sudden the community rises up and they say, we don't like that company anymore. They have a bad reputation. And that starts to have more momentum than either of those other two things. So I think at any point you could have a corporate brand or a corporate entity, and any of those things could really drastically shape how it's seen and how the brand is received.
I love that example. And it goes back to the way that's changed in just the last 50 years dramatically, which we could draw that line even further back. But yes, exactly right. There's a fragility to this Just like anybody's reputation, you can be squeaky clean, spotless forever and do one heinous thing that people figure out or find out about, even if it's a total mistake. And next thing you know, your reputation is trashed. It's the same business equivalent, as you said, like this guy getting hurt and then they screw him over.
Right.
And that, what does that have to do with a logo? What does that have to do with the latest marketing campaign? Right. And so I ask this question all the time on social to help people dispel this myth about branding or brand being specifically visual. I'll say, okay, let's make a list. A rude receptionist, crappy quality control, missed deadlines, people who can't hit deadlines. Would any of those three things damage a brand? And I will get 100% answers. Yep, that would damage a brand. Okay, how many of those problems are fixed by a new logo or the marketing department, right? This isn't marketing function. These aren't marketing functions at all. This is a problem. Now, if you were to say, well, you could fix it, well, by lying, by saying you have astounding quality control when you don't, by saying you never miss deadlines when you do, right? By saying we're the friendliest people when your receptionist is an idiot. These are all damages to the brand. So what do we mean by the brand? I want to go back to that for a minute because we talked about the poor cow, getting the hot iron or whatever. But now we have this other term where we call brand the thing that we aspire to say on brand, or my brand is this, or we believe we're this, or we want to be this. That goes back to, I think, one of the divisions and one of the problems that we have here is I personally believe that brand is effectively the largest circle that you can draw around the organization. I really do. Every single operation, decision, and item or element or anything that could influence anybody in any way goes inside that circle. And there are very few things I can think of in any business entity that don't in some way, somehow affect ultimately the perception of that company downstream. You could think, for example, of the finance department, right? Like, does the CFO live outside? If he's behind the curtain all the time, if any of those team members they're never front facing. But then my question is, okay, but then we find out that the CFO has been fudging the numbers and the SEC finds out. What happens to the brand? So if there's fragility at all involved in that person's role, they do play a role, right? So for example, the CEO might say, I'm only hiring a CFO with utmost integrity. She will always be completely 100% honest no matter what, period, because we will never fudge the numbers because I cannot afford to be seen as untrustworthy, right? That's an example of staying on brand for that CEO. I also think about something like the janitor, right? Like, does the janitor affect the brand? Generally, no, of course not. But if you then go to internal culture, which you talked about earlier, and you work for a company who values the janitor as much as they value some of the top people in that company, and that culture is from top to bottom rock solid, that brand is stronger, period. So I have a very difficult time thinking of anything that doesn't go inside, in my opinion, the purview of brand. Because if it can affect the brand, then that tells me if I could hire or put this fictitious person in charge of all of those variables and say, I always want to make sure that we act in accordance with these guidelines, these principles, this vision, this promise. This goes back to our brand promise idea, right? We always stick to this, period. That's what we do. How valuable is that person to the organization? And tell me, what is that title? What is that role?
Yeah, I was just thinking as you were talking about that, like how sports fans can be really maybe generous with their perception of the brand. That's how we get to diehard fans, right? Yes. So imagine, I'll just, paint the picture of an imaginary football team that's on. I'm not getting at a real team here, so we're not putting together the pieces. This is an East Coast team. Their thing is we're tough. We play smash mouth football. We play as a unit. We're rough and tough, and winning really matters. And we have just these crazy fans, the kinds that get angry when a bad call is made, the kinds that, get up and they're out when it's snowing. They're still there. They're bundled up. They're wearing the face paint. Like, It's the team that is behind the team, right? And then you get this one player who acts outside of the brand, right? Who is the showboat, or he's a jerk in the locker room, or the story comes out that he did something illegal. Nobody tanks the brand of that sports team. They understand that that one player is acting outside of the brand. And I think, that's a thing too that we see in our corporate cultures. When you have the janitor who acts outside of the brand, you're like, oh, this just doesn't fit culturally. And you know that whether it's the janitor or the wide receiver, like he's not going to be there long because he's not playing along with kind of the written or unwritten rules of what it means to be part of that. And it's interesting too that like when you see an actor who's embroiled in a scandal, or a CEO who says something that the internet doesn't like, how quickly you can tank a company or tank a brand or cancel somebody. But when it's a sports team, it's so interesting how much grace that we give them on the whole when you get this one little outlier.
Yeah, I mean, that is the power of a legacy brand. Very few institutions can lay claim to that sort of continuity. Most of the time in the business world, we see that almost to a detriment, where we've done it this way for 50 years, right? And that being on brand means being boring or, not innovative or whatever, but it's above all stable. And that's what a legacy brand is known for. And to be clear, by football, you meant American football before you upset all of the people in my following overseas. Sorry, fellas and friends. Josh didn't mean it that way. So yeah, I think it's interesting as we unpack, and clearly, I mean, we're going to have a lot of episodes trying to unpack a lot of these things. But you're right. You're speaking to this idea where the brand is so unbelievably strong and so many people identify it as, well, in fact, the best way to describe this is Seth Godin's approach I love, which is people like us do things like this. And he's describing that idea of the tribe, right? And that's something that in this case, I know you're talking about the Eagles, that these fans have, that, that's their character. That's what they are. That's who they are. And they are not about to allow a single transitory player who they know is going to come and go with the contract cycle to come in and say, no, we do this thing instead of that thing. And that's the power of tribes. And that's another great example of how the brand doesn't live in that institution per se. It's in the way the people read that legacy and say, well, they've done it for that long, we're going to continue to do it. It does bring up something very interesting that you spoke to a little bit earlier, and that you referenced the agency, this sort of third party who can help. One of the things that's interesting about the most powerful brands build very powerful feedback loops and mechanisms. And we don't want to create the impression that a founder starts a business and says, this is us, this is who we are forever. Like that we literally do these specific things. We make this widget for those people, and that's it. That's kind of the old, amalgamated widget company thing, story from where I always loved that.
It's the Henry Ford thing. It's you can have it in any color you want as long as it's black.
Exactly.
I think he and I would have gotten along.
Yeah, I know, right? I think it's in that case, he could afford to do that because there was no competition, right? And that was just a matter of his ethos, whatever. In the modern world, you've constantly got these feedback mechanisms, and that shifts brands to be more focused on principles, that the principles matter. And look, we see downstream effects of this that are very positive and frankly, very negative as well. This corporate Me Too-ism stuff that goes on where one does it and, well, they do it, now I have to do it. And they're all beholden to shareholders who could literally fire the CEO. So now you're basically controlled by a mob. It's just this, there's a lot going on there. But at the end of the day, you have to have a feedback mechanism where you know that your customers are hearing what you're trying to say and that they're experiencing what you think they're experiencing, and you're listening to them. And you can't get valuable data from a system that doesn't that isn't built on the idea of getting accurate data and using it. And that was one of the biggest mistakes I would always see with business leadership. They never wanted to close the feedback loop.
Yeah,
Isn't that
for
wild?
sure. It's the three monkey hear no evil, see no evil, speak no evil. Like if we don't ask, then we don't have to know what's going wrong, and we don't have to respond to it.
Exactly. And therefore, I don't have to make the difficult decisions inside of my organization to fix it. So
Yeah.
we'll just sweep it under the rug forever, and my marketing team will make up for that. I mean,
The
that's
reality
nightmare.
is probably without asking, they know what's going
They
on.
do.
So
That's why they don't
the
want to ask.
problem is the feedback loop just validates that that's what's going on.
You're totally right, man. There's that whole don't ask questions you don't want answers to. That's a real disease in the
Right.
business world. And really, I don't want to depersonalize it. Like that's everybody. All the time we do that. We do that in our own relationships. People don't like that level of authenticity because it hurts their feelings. It's hard. It makes difficult decisions come up. We would rather gloss over it. And in our personal life, you see people doing that. And that's something that's very dear to me as somebody who cares a lot about solopreneurs is, you have to understand when that baggage comes over into the business world, that's a death sentence. That's a recipe for misery in a way that you have never experienced before. You can't do that. And it's really important to me to try to break down and deconstruct these principles because I have worked with some of the top brands on the planet. I calculated the other day the total enterprise valuation of just my top 4 clients. And it was, if I remember this number correctly, but I believe it was over $491 billion. That's wild, right? And now, granted, one of those is a huge
You're
percentage.
just a solopreneur with a couple small clients.
A couple small ones, just screwing around, just playing, not really serious about it. I think that it's more critical than ever to understand as a solopreneur or a small business, how powerful brand is, because it truly is your unfair advantage. I've used this language before. We talked about this before. We don't want to mimic what General Motors is doing in terms of brand awareness and exposure. We don't have to. As a solopreneur, especially a service-based solopreneur, I've advocated forever to build a client list between 5 to 10, let's say. You can get by with 6 perfectly. And 2 can be large, 2 can be mid-tier, and 2 can be just straight up because they're experimental, interesting, new markets, whatever for you. That's a perfect mix to me for a solopreneur service person who doesn't want to build a team of, a ton of people to source out to. I experienced this in my own world where I would look across my, 7 clients at any given time. I was making a massive impact inside of their world. But when I went outside of my own bubble, I was looking at that and going, yeah, I basically interact with 8 people. That's my level of like direct person-to-person impact. Now downstream, things like what I've done for Firestone, I'm impacting thousands and thousands of lives by clarifying, the manuals of the things I've done for them. But I don't talk to those people. I don't get to share, conversations with them and emails and stuff. So that's one of the big decisions that I have to move out and help people more directly. But I have to help them understand that the tactics that these people are using at the big level where they're literally paying billions of dollars a year to push their brand. You don't have to do all those things. You don't need 1 million people to be aware of you. It's like Kevin Kelly's 1,000 true fans thing. For a lot of people, if you're even a product base, you need 1,000 true fans. If you're service base, you need like 10.
Yeah, you're not wrong. It's wild too, thinking about one of the things going back to Marty Neumeier that he talks about in the brand gap is brand value, like how much that adds to what the corporate valuation is. And I think he uses the example of Coca-Cola. And, there's more nuance to it than this, but it's kind of the difference between what Coca-Cola is worth versus like a generic soft drink company. And the amount of brand value, the difference between being Coke and not being Coke is, in the millions or billions at this point. And you can think of that difference too in your solo business brand. Like, what is another consultant able to charge and what am I able to charge? How busy is that guy and how busy am I? It's pretty wild to think about even how that scales down to a single person entity.
And it's totally true. Yeah, Interbrand charts all of that. And, very broadly, Coca-Cola's way up there. Apple's the top. They're the first $1 trillion company. I actually just looked this up recently. If you wanted to just draw a general trend line across what they're measuring there, it's easy to just kind of characterize it as most of these big companies can attribute half of their overall enterprise value to their brand. And so that this becomes the question is now, what do we mean by that? Isn't their brand the whole thing? And
Right.
so this is where we get into some of these discussions that it's difficult to talk about because yes, their brand is the whole thing, but these companies have become so massive and so large that the Apple logo on a package means something at a grand scale. And we can start to deconstruct, like you said, these generic things. So products and features alone, on their own, not tied to anything else. I've always struggled a little bit with this idea because you can't extract those. This isn't the pharmaceutical world where you literally have generic drugs compared to the original. And even then, it's a generic of what? It's a generic of a brand name. People still go back and associate it to the brand. There's no escaping it. Just like you said at the beginning,
Right.
you can't escape it. So thinking about that now is for Solopreneur on a more individual level. I think this is where it's critical for people to understand this. If you look at my company with Sandpaper Studio, I operated with literally zero traditional marketing, literally zero traditional outreach sales tactics, and generated millions of dollars. And I'm a freaking designer and brand strategist. Like if anybody should have a hot site, and hot marketing, that's the guy, right? I didn't need it because my personal brand was so strong with those 10 people who they knew. And listen, they were getting hit up all the time by agencies. You witnessed this personally from some of the people who would come after my clients. These are massive, well-known names and frankly, great people, great teams, powerful teams, and nonstop for years rejected by my clients. That's my brand and its strength. They knew that I knew their markets. They knew what they were getting with me. They knew how I worked. They knew my price points. They knew the quality. I wish people would understand that and go, okay, well, how do I now as a solopreneur line out all of those items and do the things I need to do to create that impression on people, to really create that experience for people so that it's true. Like I experience this when I work with Torrey, when I work with Josh. That's what I get at all times. That's our brand promise. Like to sit down and think about those things, to make sure, like, listen, if I miss a deadline, that's no good. That is really bad for my brand. I have to make sure I never miss a deadline. Even the agencies miss deadlines, and that's a huge competitive advantage now for me and you and any other, solopreneur. I can achieve the same results for a fraction of the cost because I don't have the overheads, but I do have the expertise. That's a huge advantage for solopreneurs. I'm obviously teaching that stuff. I want people to learn. That's easy to learn. I'm going to show them how to do that. You've been around it forever. You understand it inherently. You know exactly the power of these things. But I think back to the original point, it's difficult for people on our level, solopreneur level and small business level, to relate what Coca-Cola and Apple and IBM and these massive corporate institutions are doing on their brand level to what we do on our brand level. And they're born of the same things, but they just don't end up looking the same on the outside.
Yeah. Well, obviously this is going to be the first of many conversations that you and I have about brand. Maybe this is a good place to leave it and jump in next time. I'd be really curious for people in the comments to share like where we should go next with the branding conversation, because there's so many different routes that we can take this. And, for us, it's sort of always branding. So anything that we end up talking about, whether it's VR or AI or, I was really excited to talk about Oppenheimer, but that's a whole nother, that's a whole nother conversation. But for me, it's still through the context of brand. So
yes, sir. We just opened a whole bunch of doors and told people, well, look in there. We'll talk about it later. But I think it's a great start. Again, I know you and I could sit and talk for literally months and years because we have about these things, and it's going to be exciting to kind of unpack it. But you're right. We need to know what people are looking for. I can feed some of this over from Twitter too, because people have questions all the time. But that comment section, yeah. Is this the hit the comment section plug?
Yeah, I think so. I
Perfect.
think your Twitter account is the comment section though. So
Currently,
we'll see how that works out.
We can work on that. Cool, man. We will definitely talk more about it, shed some light for people. In the meantime, final question. What do you think is a good book for people to read to learn about branding?
I mean, I think in case we haven't pitched it enough today, if you haven't read The Brand Gap by Marty Neumeier, that's a great place to start. And if you have read that, he's got like 4 other follow-on books that are really good. Zag, I think, is one of the really strong ones in that series as well. So if you haven't read those 2, that's where I would start out.
Totally agree. And for those who aren't aware, Josh has a book about building a bold brand that is, I would say, geared towards a specific company set, professional services. You can describe it. But it unpacks some of the very principal, approaches to branding in a way that I think is fantastic and a very good place to start. So when I recommend books, I'll think of things like, again, David Aker's work and Van Auken's work and some of these that are just like encyclopedias. I mean, even as a brand strategist, I'm like, whew, I got to chew through this stuff slowly. It's so dense. I wouldn't recommend starting there. But that's one of the things I love about your book too, is it just introduces so many simple concepts. So plug, boom, Bold Brand 2.0, great book. All right, brother, let's wrap this up. Talk to you soon.
Sounds good. See ya.